Uh, so welcome everyone to the Open Humans Community Call on June 23rd. We just had our go around. I failed to record that, but two topics of interest. One is discussing some recent news stories or social media stuff around wearables that are claiming to be useful with respect to detecting and tracking for COVID-19 and coronavirus. And this is, of course, very similar to the stuff that we've been doing with quantified flu. And I was curious how folks felt about the claims that were being made and sort of opinions on whether it's responsible or not, or like what responsible actors should do here. And Gary has noted that that people interested in these stories and maybe skeptical of the claims being made are also potentially people that would be interested in contributing and participating in quantified flu. So we can talk a bit about that. And the other thing to talk about is bengal.js. Bastian has put together a small program that works on the bengal, and he might be able to talk a little bit about how easy that was to do. And I found it really easy to install. So let's make sure to make time for that. So with that, let's start by talking about these wearable things. Gary has posted some links to, I think, are these both for the WHOOP study, or one is for the WHOOP? Maybe you can tell us about the links and what you've seen so far, because you're more on top of this than I am.
Sure, these are the two most recent, and they're the most aggressive. Actually, the second link was the one that came out first a couple of weeks ago. This is one of the probably half dozen, at least 5 Aura studies that are going on right now. So the ring is widely out there in academic community. They've been enrolling subjects. They're typically sending them email surveys about their symptoms. Some of them have associated apps. So they're quite similar to quantified flu, but they're using a aggregated Aura supplied research database that I believe is being organized or at least partially supported by Benji Smar, who some of you may know. He's a longtime quantified self contributor, participant, very knowledgeable. So he's kind of doing the helping support the data supply for these studies, but he's not in any way responsible for the claims that the researchers are making. The fundamental insight, as we all know, is that some of this data can indicate some kind of immune response or sickness onset before you feel any symptoms. They all have slightly different methods, in some cases very different methods, but the fundamental thing is to point some machine learning algorithm at the data and have some kind of training set and output some set of hits on people who you don't know, or the algorithm doesn't know in advance that they're tested positive for COVID-19, and then tune it up until you get enough positive hits. WHOOP is doing this with Aura, they're doing it with different kinds of data, but one of the most important kinds of data is resting heart rate, which we're using. WHOOP is using a kind of data that we're not using, which is respiratory rate at night. And they're saying their thing is really murky, and I did read the paper. There's not data in the paper or anything, but it looks like what they're trying to do is distinguish people who are symptomatic with COVID-19 from people who are symptomatic but not with COVID-19. And they're using respiratory rate at night to distinguish between those two sets of symptomatic people. They also make a claim about identifying an onset of symptoms before symptoms occur, but their hit rate on that set is only 20%, and it's not, they don't report how many false positives they have. So to me, I just read that as probable BS, but maybe they'll publish the paper and we'll find out it's different. But there probably is something in there around respiratory rate at night, distinguishing people who have COVID-19 from people who don't, since respiratory issues are significant in some large set of those people. So, and then just one more thing, the output of all of this work right now is a big ripple, I would say, not a big wave, but a big ripple of hype around using wearables to predict COVID-19, which is not yet possible.
I've added a link to the NBA tweet, which Bastian said a student shared with him, and so it made the rounds. Uh, and I also want to note that I do think the Aura Ring can get respiratory rate data, and so I don't know if we're getting that.
I think it can, because I heard from Scott Liebrand, who's doing the CoEpi project, that he was thinking about just running some kind of cron job on his Aura API to get his respiratory rate at night. So he's one of those characters who kind of reads this stuff and says, well, I don't necessarily believe the conclusion, but respiratory rate at night, that's interesting.
Bastian, do you know if you thought about adding it, or?
I mean, I'm pretty sure that if the Aura API gives it, at least we do import it. We are just not exposing it in quantified flow specifically at this point. So we do have the data, it's just not being processed and put to the front end at this point, but we could add it pretty simply, I guess.
And the interesting thing here is it's distinguishing between COVID-19 and non-COVID-19 once you are sick, and versus trying to detect that you're getting sick. This is a little different, but still seems useful. That said, yeah, I don't know if you have other links, Gary, to like sort of the hype that comes that these things engender, right?
I think you could just do a Google search and you'll see it now. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's actually, you know, the outcome is something that bothers me, because I feel like it was kind of predictable for anyone that engages in trying to do and report research, especially if they're working together with the companies. But I did want to hear how other people thought about these situations. Morgan, you mentioned earlier during our go around that you felt like there's a parallel here with EEG stuff.
I wasn't going to necessarily say EEG, but so, you know, Tom Insel came to Google, who's a former head of NIMH, and was heading their kind of digital health initiative that was focused on mental illness. And but it was very clear, though, that it had nothing to do with like any kind of biological test or any kind of new understanding of physiology, but was very much focused on these kinds of digital health products, and which is kind of, you know, Valley code for like, we're going to mine your clicks and your GPS data and your, you know, anything that we can pick up from your social media, to you know, give, you know, they weren't necessarily claiming diagnostics, but that was essentially what they were trying to do, and it's now become the focus, somewhat the focus of Mindstrong, which is the company he now works for, which was a startup but just got a massive infusion of cash. And you know, so again, coming from psychiatry, like, we kind of like understand the impetus to choose these kind of like surrogate measures, because right now, you know, unlike COVID, like, we do diagnosis off verbal self-report and other, you know, behaviors. So why not, you know, look at patterns in your, you know, social media activity, or your just your activity in general, you know? I mean, it's anyway, so I understand it. Obviously with COVID, there's a clear biological test that can be done. And I think it's really interesting, the patterns that they've gotten from I think it was the, I forget the particular smart thermometer company that they were picking, you know, these like, you know, you know, so it's from an epidemiology standpoint, at, you know, like a public health standpoint, I think there's some really interesting data, you know. I think it's really interesting, you know, but at the same time, like, I'd prefer them to be, you know, if they see the smart thermometer data changing something, like going and testing the sewage water as opposed to just picking up on the yeah, like giving everybody wearables is, you know, this is obviously a time where people are going to latch on to easy solutions that are also, you know, sell products. So it's yeah.
I think I have a concern that like this current over hyper kind of PR, once things actually materialize and there's been enough research and time to validate and not validate, that if this does not work through when the reality is that something is working, it won't be taken seriously. So I think it undermines sort of this, on one regard, you get more excitement and interest and maybe more data, which is what everyone is always like interested in collecting, but it might be under the false impression that this is going to be a solve all. So I have sort of concerns because we've seen an article about two scientists who published about the hydrochlorine, the drug, and it was completely false, and so it got retracted, and there's a lot of, I think, lack of trust was destroyed, and so I worry that this is another time that this might happen.
I want to just add maybe it's a counterpoint, I don't know. Just out of my I'm just naturally allergic to people who want to withhold information in the name of, you know, helping others. So the idea that you need some smart people out there to keep the rest of us dumb people from finding out some information that could help us. And so when I look at something like that, I look at that, well, it looks like BS to me, but, you know, I don't know why I care all that much. If somebody wants to spout BS, you know, if the NBA wants to say this, like, why do I care? Now, you can argue that that's going to ruin it for the rest of us who are trying to do legitimate science, but science is not going to care. Like, you know, if it works, it works. If our way of doing things works, it works. And yeah, maybe there'll be some, you know, will slow down our ability to be able to get, you know, taken seriously or something, but it's kind of our problem. But in the end, if there really is an approach here that works, you know, science will find a way to make sure that, you know, it gets discovered. And if it doesn't work, then science will find that too. So I'm a little bit less on the side that we need to care about this one way or the other. I guess just, you know, overall improvements in science literacy is really the solution, not to somehow artificially suppress people making bad claims. I don't know if I really believe that or not, but, you know, prove me wrong.
Well, Richard, I would say, like, kind of as a journalist, like, you have to have a little bit of a sense of humor about stuff like this. Like, you know, things get out of hand and people are excited. But I do think, you know, I mean, we're entitled to roll our eyes at it a bit, you know, but I do think it's most interesting as an opportunity to engage people, at least some small subset of people, in using these data types for some kind of epistemic gain, right? Like, because they're not going to get it. Like, you look at this stuff. I had a note from my brother-in-law, you know, like, hey, look, I have an Oura ring. It can tell me now that if I'm going to come down with COVID or not. So, I mean, do I think scientists ought to know better than to kind of like say that stuff and then say, oh, we were misinterpreted? Yes, I do. But I really think the most interesting thing is, like, yeah, maybe exposing respiratory rate, and also the power of these studies comes from the fact that they really are getting people to fill out these surveys or using these apps. So this was an insight right from the beginning of quantified flu of, like, well, I mean, Matt, you and I talked about it months and months ago. You were like, I want symptom tracking. So I think, you know, quantified flu is pretty underpowered compared to these studies. And of course it is, because these studies are funded, you know, studies where they're recruiting people, but it would be great to show what these data types can do when used as part of a mix of inputs into decision making, as opposed to understood as flashing you like a red or a green light.
I think.
Oh,
well, I am finding like the stuff on like distinguishing whether you have COVID or non-COVID once you know you're sick is really interesting, knowing that COVID testing has a lot of like false negatives as it is. And so if you have a different source that's giving you a positive, I mean, I don't know that we can try, like it's added information. So like adding that information sounds great. Also, I want to note that I clicked through and the WHOOP study is clearly published by WHOOP itself, which I like better than seeing something sort of like borrowing academic credentials and then like saying researchers from academic institution, which feels like a lot more like moving credentials into a product. So I really appreciate the clarity of like, this is the company that did the research itself. But I don't know how others feel about that. And that is to note that there's this sort of way in which academic credentials can be used to make something like promoted as more legitimate, and they are drawing on like the general trust in science when that happens, and that it's not democratic, right? Those academics have entered into a very specific arrangement with that company when they do that. So I think personally that's something I find more troubling. It's not that, but I agree, Richard, that we shouldn't suppress information or gatekeep. And that's almost why I'm like more comfortable with like what self-publishing, like this is what we saw. Like I don't want to gatekeep here.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I agree as well. I mean, at least there's like the conflict of interest is much clearer to everyone. If like on the company website, the company says our product is great, then you know to take it with a grain of salt. But if the university or whatever says, we found out that the Oura ring is amazing, like many people will not think about that they actually had a partnership with and no one reads the conflict of interest statement closely. So I think that's more problematic. And I mean, yes, we can't suppress it, but like at the same time, it screws over trust in science for everyone else who's not doing it.
There's a parallel in education in terms of external parties validating that particular education technology works in the classroom. And then there are companies who publish their own sort of findings. I think that if those companies, when they publish it, they are very clear of who is involved and why they're involved. To Matt, to your point, if they're very clear that this is an internal process, I can read it with a grain of salt and be like, okay, I can interpret it. When they make the claims of like, oh, we've partnered, but this partnership has been an investor in our company, then you start to be like distrustful. And I don't think everyone does that due diligence of interpretation. I think we have like a mindset towards like reading that and being like, what's behind the scenes, but maybe the general public doesn't do that. And they see the face value as the same thing. I think that causes ripple effects. We've seen it in education technology where there's a lot of distrust that has happened now. People are looking for this research and validation, and now it's like even people who are doing it correctly are like scrutinized and being like, there's not room for that level. I think it's good to have the discussions.
I think another thing I wanted to recognize is like, I don't know to what extent it's like a sour grapes thing. And like, I want to check myself on that of like, you have all this data and that's not fair. You got to like study it and come to conclusions and I don't have that data. And so I'm just going to find critical things to say about you getting that data.
I think you should hold on to that though. I think this is where there's something productive here, because there is like, if it were the case that quantified flu was just a kind of weakly powered version of what is going on in these academic research studies, there would really be no reason to do it, because they're going to have a big step up, and we can just learn from them. Like, that's good, that's not bad. I do think though there's something missing from these studies, which is the highly contextualized, it's the next step. Like, let's assume these studies are all really good in the end. And you're like, yes, you can get like 80, 90% accurate warning several days in advance of whether you're positive for COVID-19 from your Oura Ring data. Okay, that's what the claim in the first link I gave. So that's great, right? But we also know that if they're 90% accurate, the 10% results that are inaccurate are almost all going to be false positives because the prevalence is not very high. So you test 1 million people, you've got 100,000 that are wrong, but there's probably of that 1 million people, there's only 20,000 or something that have COVID-19 anyway. So that means most of those wrong results are false positives. That means the number of false positives is going to outnumber the number of true positives substantially, which means that when you take that test, even if you get a false positive, that's great to know, right? You're like, okay, I'm more likely to have COVID-19, but I'm still more likely not to have it than to have it. So what is your next step? So even assuming that this research is great and we all get to use it right away, there's a lot of work we have to do in terms of understanding our infection status. And that's where I think quantified flu comes in, right? Because we have a lot of potential to integrate that data with other kinds of data. Like, we know if we were out all night drinking, or we know if we have a migraine headache, or we know a lot of the other things that would be likely to lead to that false positive. And I don't think that's very easy for people. That's actually super hard for people in general too. So I would say sour grapes, it's kind of like just tilt it 1/2 turn into like, wait, what do we have to add here?
It makes me curious to what extent we can use the findings and like to what extent they're well described in ways that we can turn around and apply that algorithm. And I have not dug in.
Well, I've been looking for, somebody probably made it and I just haven't seen it, for like some kind of Bayesian calculator, like some web-based calculator where we just input our like our local prevalence plus our test results, and we output a likelihood of being infected with COVID-19. It would be wonky, but that's possible to imagine.
Yeah, so that's a potential to do, is to look into them and imagine whether we can implement some of that finding. But if we did do that, what would be a responsible way of presenting that information? Gary is laughing like, oh, now we made our own problem, right?
Exactly. Use our Bayesian calculator and tell yourself what you have to
It's like based on this official finding.
It is pretty much the standard intro Bayesian statistics example, right? Is that this is, you're testing for something that's very rare, and it is also not a perfect test, and calculating then if you receive a positive, what is your likelihood of actually, like that's pretty much chapter 1 in Bayesian stats. A calculator, and that's why a calculator is so useful, because it's a counterintuitive.
Somebody must have built one already, right? That's just irresistible.
I mean, and some of this is going to be like, what is your exposure? Like, how many contacts have you had? How much do you trust them? Are you worried that you have it? And I don't even. And so at some point it goes beyond quantifiable and really into qualitative stuff.
I'm assuming
for movement, we have that tracking. So I don't, does Aura have GPS tracking? Is that a feature that they're using? Because you could potentially add that as your potential risk, that the more you travel outside of a particular radius.
No, I think that's going to be very noisy and compared to just people knowing how many. I mean, because I walk 5 or 6 minutes to take my kid to camp at the YMCA, which is substantially increasing our exposure as a household. But I've made that calculated risk. And so I have these contexts, and I'm bringing someone into my home to help watch the other kids. And so our risk of exposure has gone way up compared to, say, a month or two ago when we weren't having any of those contacts. But maybe I think it's much less than, going maskless to a party of a dozen people in a private household, which, some of that stuff is happening behind closed doors. But at the same time, I know that as I talk to other people, there's very different sort of qualitative assessments of someone's personal exposure and what they should be doing to avoid it. Like, I have my own opinions of what constitutes responsible behavior, but people have very different opinions right now. And I don't really know how to create that prior is what I'm trying to get to, is how to help people create their prior, or how to interpret that sort of, how to do that Bayesian thing, maybe in a less rigorous way, process for themselves, to walk them through it of you have an information update. Where were you before? Where might you be now? No thoughts. I mean, I'm sure there's language that, it might just be a wording thing, figuring out the right wording.
I think this is a good one for the forum, actually, for one of the forums anyway, kind of discussing how to set your priors. But I'm now looking at Bastian's graph, so maybe since we only have 15 minutes
posted.
You want to switch to talking about the bengal?
No, I can just, because Gary had asked in the chat whether the respiratory rate goes up or down if you have COVID-19, and I just quickly made my retrospective quantified flu events, ran them with the respiratory rate, and there seems to be no clear signal, at least for a regular cold.
It was non-COVID.
It was all non-COVID what I had in my retrospective events. So at least there, you can have a look in the image I posted in the chat that there seems to be no clear signal for non-COVID things. But my gut feeling would be that your respiratory rate should increase if you have COVID, because lung function is decreased. Basically, you need to breathe more to get the same amount of oxygen. I would assume that's the thing, but that's just making it up on the fly.
Where did you post this?
It's in the chat of Zoom.
Oh, the Zoom chat.
Yeah, but I can put it also the image into our notes, of course.
I think it's super neat, and this is a perfect example of the supplementary function of quantified flu to these kind of academic studies. Because Bastian, I look at this right away and I think, well, this is reassuring in the sense of analyzing our own data, because your respiratory rate at night is very stable. So right there, that's really nice to see, right? It's, it varies night to night, but you've got a pretty 3-year period in which, your average respiratory rate is really, it's between 15 and 16 breaths a minute, 14 and 16 breaths a minute for 3 years straight. So that's good. That's interesting, right? If you saw something if you saw it go to 18 breaths a minute, you would have good reason to suspect that something was going on in your body unusual.
Well, it might be interesting for people also interested in who believe they may have had COVID-19 but weren't able to get testing, may have retrospective data from a ring that they would want to look at. So that'd be cool to add.
Notice even the outliers are really not very big outliers here.
Right. It's all pretty close, and even the outliers seem to be pretty random.
Yeah.
There was probably something else going on during the night which made it go up or down.
Really neat. I think that's something I wish I had at Aarrhythmia.
What are the red vertical lines? What do they mean?
That's the actual sickness event where I did have a cold.
Okay.
And you will,
that's inputted by you, so from your memory or records.
I can put the link to my temperature and heart rate graphs, which I have for those as well, so we can compare them if I can find the notebook.
Well, hopefully I'll get more time to be contributing more to quantified flu soon. It's,
That did not work as expected.
I wonder if anything else gives you respiratory rate besides Whoop and Aura.
I think Fitbit might do it. I'm not sure whether they exposed the data, but I think they started even looking into predicting sleep apnea. This came with one of their latest updates because I gave my Fitbit to a friend who's now wearing it and told me there was an update and now I get this additional graphs every night.
So would you like to talk about the Bengal? Do we have any further thoughts on these published findings, how we feel, what to do? It sounds like what to do is to try it ourselves if we can.
Yeah. And sure, otherwise I can talk about the Bengal, which currently is on my desk charging to try it out tomorrow. So yeah, Gary had talked a lot about the one button tracker, especially during the self-research chats, for just having like a simple device to press a button and it tracks when you press the button and for how long. And with the Bengal, I just made the same thing based on using one of their buttons. So the device has, can we see it? Yeah, has like 3 buttons, and if you press them now, the top one, it will like turn on the little light telling you the button is pressed right now. And if you let go, it stores the start and end time of you pressing the button and letting go. And it was really easy to do. So I think I would, huh?
Yeah, show it again.
Okay, let's see. So press the button, the light comes on, let go, the light goes off, and now the event is stored on the device, and that's all there is to it. And it works even in all the other applications which you can run on at the same time, which can be actually a bit annoying, because you also use the button for scrolling up in menus. So if you press it for too long, then you accidentally trigger an event which wasn't one. Which is why I'm looking forward to the Puck.js, which doesn't have any other functionality. It's just a button, so you are less likely to accidentally trigger anything. But yeah, it was super easy. It took me around 20 minutes, I think, to implement the main functionality. And I think it was yesterday that the people that run the Bengal.js App Store merged my little pull request of like 30 lines of JavaScript into their App Store, and now every Bengal.js user can just install it from the main website and have their own little one-button tracker available. And I mean, I
want to add my installation experience.
Yeah.
So like the Bengal is really easy to install, to use, because it connects via Bluetooth to your laptop into a web browser with JavaScript. So you just sync Chrome, connect it with your Bengal, and then you have on a web page like the apps that are on your Bengal, and you can go to Bastian's fork of the App Store. So you can just go to his website and click an upload button and use that web page to upload it to your Bengal. And right there next to the upload button is also like a download data button. So
yeah, if you enable screen sharing, you can just show it. But
well, I don't have my Bengal hooked up. Do you want? Me.
Yeah, if you allow me to share my screen, I can do it. I promise there will be no
Zoom
porn.
Okay, that's enabled.
Okay, let's see. Where is Chrome? There we go. So this is the general App Store, and let's see whether the one button.
Is your Bengal already connected?
No,
I don't know if you want to
connected yet. Yeah, I wanted to show, but let's see whether it's actually here already or not. But I don't see it.
Go to your your page though, because you have your version of.
Yeah, that, whoops. Okay. So that's my version of it, which just looks just the same. So now all you need to do really, let's hope it finds it now. We can pair to the bengal. Yeah.
My point is that it wasn't gatekeeping on the case of like,
Yeah.
you didn't have to wait for it to get into the App Store to give people this link. They can just go to your own version of the App Store.
So now it is already connected, and it's, you can see at the bottom, it's getting the list of apps on my bengal. And then it should show the list, hopefully. If it's not working, no, there we go. And now you can see here's the one button tracker that I made. And if you want to download the data from the device, you just press the button and press download. And now it gets all the data.
You can download the data. And it goes straight to your computer. So it's not on Bastian's website.
Right, so that's the thing. Like, it's like, while the website is there to basically facilitate the communication, it's just through JavaScript and the web browser making the connection via the web Bluetooth Low Energy to the device. But the data is never stored anywhere but on the device and now on my computer, so it never goes anywhere else. It's actually pretty nice as well. And that's
it's a static website with a bunch of JavaScript that you're running client-side stuff on. Yeah.
This is great. And so, Bastian, have you looked at the way the table looks coming off of the Toddy Labs one-button tracker? I'm just wondering if a Jupyter notebook that could take the Toddy Labs one-button tracker can also take the Bengal one-button tracker, or if there's some kind of transformation.
If you can show me your data, because I don't have the one-button tracker from the Toddy Labs.
Yeah, let me.
In principle, it could.
Yeah, good. I'm just going to.
And yeah, just to show how little code this actually is. So this is all that I programmed to make the one-button work. And for those who speak JavaScript, it's pretty easy. And half of this is still print statements, which I could actually remove. So it's
like some of your code lines here are debug statements, button pressed.
So yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I had like a kind of a tech question, because it is annoying to have to use that button. Is there any sort of ability to do haptics, or like maybe not haptics? Sorry, like tapping the button. Can people like just, you know how like Apple Watches respond to being tapped and stuff? Is that like a type of signal on the Bengal that can be accessed?
So you can access the accelerometer data. So you could make one where it responds to tapping, or you could.
You'd have to be. Would it be like battery hungry because it'd be monitoring it the whole time?
I think it would be a bit more battery hungry, because you need to at least have in some kind of frequency read out the accelerometer data. What probably would be less battery hungry is reading the touch screen. I guess because it has like a 2-button touch screen. It's like very simple. Like the left half of the screen is one button and the right half of the screen is the other touch screen button. So you could just somehow trigger for tapping on the display. This might
actually
work.
That's interesting, because it brings up an idea of like a 2-finger tap, like if you know that you're hitting both of them at once in a certain way. I was brainstorming if there's alternative ways to use the Bengal as a 1-button.
Yeah,
but
this
I
would
think
definitely be possible too.
But I think part of the purpose of this demo is to say that it was surprisingly easy to create this.
Yeah, and also like it took them, I think it's basically one person who's looking after the Git repository of the Bengal.js app store. It was like less than a week basically for them to say like, yeah, now everyone can use it. That's amazing.
So
I'm actually curious about, go on. I'm curious about the governance there, because it's like, what if someone creates an app that's doing something actually sketchy, and like whose responsibility is it, right, to review that? I mean, it brings us up all the sort of open source security issues.
Yeah, I think so far it's basically Gordon who made the whole device, who's looking over it. And I've seen that he does comment on other people's pull requests to say, actually, I will not deploy this until you make the following changes. They were not about security. They were more about like, you run a person's battery empty so quickly because you made something stupid. Can you change this? So that seems to work pretty well overall, at least so far. And as you said, like there's no gatekeeping because you can just make a fork and make your own app store and say someone else now has the governance for this particular branch of the Bengal.js app store.
So Bastian, I just uploaded a CSV into the chat, all 2K of my Aarrhythmia data. And I think what you see, just to tell you what you'll see there is in the first column is the timestamp, obviously. In the second column, I believe this is pressure sensor. Like, I think it's telling me how hard I push it. I never use that data. And then in the third is the milliseconds.
Okay, yeah, no, I don't think the Bengal gives you the how hard you press the button, but we can just make an empty column for that and then give you the same data. So far, I did not recalculate the difference between the timestamps, so it just gives you the start and end time, but we could just make that on the device and update
and you know, honestly, I only use the timestamp in anything that I do, but of course, I'm interested in, like, if notebooks get made, then one would want to be able to use the input from both different devices, which is pretty simple input. So you could always have a notebook that turned one into the other, or stay a part of your notebook, but you know.
Yeah, and just maybe to round it out. I mean, for some people I've seen it already on the Slack in the Bengal.js chat, but so yesterday when I left the office and wanted to go home, I ran into one of our makerspace people who's currently interested in tracking tremor in his mom because she has multiple sclerosis and now got a Botox injection, which in 2 weeks they say should reduce her tremor. And he was, how can I track this? And now he's giving her like a little Arduino thing that he made in the Maker Lab, and we will try out the Bengal.js tomorrow and the Apple Watch with a specialized app for it, all at the same time and rotating through the positions so we can actually get comparable data to see how well this data from the Bengal.js can work for it. So that's another nice little use case, which
really great.
Just by chance came up, and I will just make a little program to collect the data tomorrow morning before we meet with his mom.
Great.
Very hackable.
How long did it take to come? Just curious, to arrive after you ordered it.
Matt, how long did it take for you? I mean, that's more comparable than getting it to France.
I guess so, yeah.
Gosh, not very long. Maybe like a week.
Okay.
I don't.
Yeah,
I was surprised by it arriving.
Yeah, I think it was pretty quick. I mean, I think it took nearly as long to get it over to France from the UK as it took you to get it in California. But yeah, so I hope that next week I have the Puck.js things that I can play around with, which have lots of additional sensors which the Bengal doesn't have. So it has an accurate temperature sensor, which is calibrated unlike the Oura ones, and it has a magnetometer, and it has, I don't know what else even. So there's like a lot of additional data you can get, which the Bengal doesn't give you.
It looks like I got it on June 2nd, but I'm trying to, and I ordered it during our meeting, so I think you can use those to figure it out. It was fast.
Great, that's fine.
I guess we should wrap up, but I kind of had a question for Gary about one buttons, in that I just feel like I'm lacking imagination on what I'm would do with it. And is there like a list of ideas of like?
That's a great idea. We should open that up. Definitely, I've heard many ideas, and I have them kind of queued up. But one thing to keep in mind is that although I've so far mostly used it for single presses, with the right notebooks, you can use double presses or triple presses, even to do like Likert scale type of things. So you can do self-surveys, or you can also use the same button to collect 2 different types of data. So that's also opens up all kinds of possibilities. And I have used it in very intense periods, like 20-minute periods, in which I've done like 100 presses. So there's like micro phenomenon. Like I've used it to measure return of attention and stuff like that. So you can scale it from like you know, right now for my Aarrhythmia project, I'm sometimes only have one press in a day, all the way down to like, you know, 100 presses in 20 minutes. So plus different kinds of presses. So I think it's a great challenge to your imagination, but anything that you can remark on or observe with your attention, including environmental data, like I use it all for myself, but you can use it to observe phenomena happening out in the world. Maybe you saw the QS project somebody did about interruptions, where they tracked how many times they were interrupted during the course of a day. That's a great project for a one-button tracker. So yeah, go crazy.
Gary, for that, I have an app. It's a time logger app that just you press on your phone, and it starts a timer. So it doesn't have necessarily that feedback of press. You could potentially do that. Is the biggest advantage of having that tracker is that it's more discreet than a phone, or that it's in your pocket or in your wrist, that you could kind of do it without much notice. Because I have to pull up my phone to start the tracker. Okay.
Yes, that's exactly it. And I think that's really huge. So you know, you can do it without somebody noticing, you can do it without interrupting yourself. That's one of the reasons I did this test of like return of attention. I was like, I'm going to sit and meditate, and is pressing this button going to be even possible while I do that? Like without changing, you know, and I was able to press it like without even like interrupting myself there after I got used to it. So, and I think even Thomas, who kind of did this one, he once actually did the like ergonomics or whatever it's called, like measurement of like how long, because he tracked for several years what he was interested in on his phone using one of these tracking apps. And so he did a bunch of timing tests, like how long does it take me to make my observation? It's just dramatically easier.
Well, I think we should wrap up. Maybe we'll have more exciting quantified flu updates next week, or talk about something entirely different. But it's great to have folks here. And I guess I'll see some folks maybe on Thursday when we do self-research chats. Okay, have a great Tuesday, folks.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.